get this to work. Now, one of the things about the presentation is that I have this presentation divided into the PowerPoint, and then I've got it into Nick's software. I've got it on Lightroom, and I also have it on Photoshop. So I will be disconnecting my share screen to be able to go to those and then reshare, because that seems to be the only way to do it. So let's see how well this works, and cross my fingers. Okay. All right. So I'd like to thank everybody to be here tonight. We didn't have a choice. We do have the Republican convention going on, and I'm not sure that's a choice, but it is an option. It's been involved in this, particularly those individuals, Rawls, Fraser, who got a chance to review this for me, as well as Liz, who spent her time looking at it as well and making some excellent suggestions. So with that, let me go ahead and get started here. I'm going to be focused on this subject, better black and white images. And our goals are this: establishing reasons for converting to black and white, produce better black and white images through a sound system, learn to look at a scene and use spot metering to determine the best exposure settings for your camera, and then understanding dynamic range and how it relates to camera settings and increasing the quality of your photograph. We'll also talk about the histogram, contrast, light direction, also texture, determine if a photograph should be converted to black and white. And then finally, we'll talk about methods by which we can convert to black and white, and we're using the full of dynamic range to do so. All right, so what we're doing tonight is, first of all, why do you convert to black and white? Sound system, and then talking about the dynamic range and the quality of your photographs, and then demonstrate in-camera techniques, demonstrate how your histogram, contrast, texture, and light direction can be used, determine if a photograph can be or should be converted to black and white, and finally using Photoshop and Lightroom to convert color photographs into black and white. So let's go ahead and get started. By the way, using Zoom to me is a real challenge, because when I'm in the classroom, as I used to be years ago, I get to see everybody's reaction. Here, it's just the screen, and unless I hear somebody snoring in the background, I have to do something. So don't hesitate if you can't hear me well or need to have me repeat something. Please do so. That's important for this presentation. So why do we want to convert to black and white? Well, we've all had images that have been beautifully colored. Think about the image that you may have taken in the fall on a beautiful lake with all the reds and greens and everything else. But really what you want to do in this case is to convert it to black and white, to remove those color distractions. So that's one of the reasons. We also, in some cases, want to emphasize the contrast that shows up. And that's, black and white can do that very effectively. Sometimes we have a very textural-oriented photograph, and the color, again, is a distraction. And what we want to do is bring out the texture in that photograph, and we can do so by converting it to black and white. One of the other aspects is many of us, unfortunately, are pretty lazy like me. I don't like getting up early in the morning. So I'm shooting in midday, and that bright sunlight on things particularly good. So black and white can help with that conversion to reduce some of the emphasis on the sunlight. And lastly, but also importantly, is that we may want to create a vintage look in our images. When we think about the classical black and white photographers, Ansel Adams comes to mind. And even though he did shoot some color, his black and white images are truly the vintage look that we go, oh, those are wonderful. So, the zone system. Well, the zone system is a photographic technique for determining optimal film exposure and development. And it's formulated by Ansel Adams and Fred Archer. And there are 12 zones from black to white. And the black zone is 0, and the white zone is 11 or 10. It was primarily used in film photography to determine the tonal values in all 11 zones. And each zone, by the way, is one stop higher or lower, and we'll get into this in more detail. Following slide is an example of those tonal values. Where we are, you look at the zones, you have the absolute black on the left side with a 0, all the way moving to the right with a zone of 10. And if you'll notice the information down below, and this is not the only time you'll see this slide, so you'll get a chance to get the information more. If you're really talking about zone 0, we're talking about pure black. There is no detail, no texture in that. And if we move to zone 10, pure white with no details or texture. So what we're really shooting for, if we talk about a full range, is to go from 0 to 10 when we take these images, particularly in relationship to black and white. Now, here's Ansel Yosemite, which is one of these classic images, it's vintage image taken from tunnel view in the Yosemite. And it really seems to be a huge dynamic range here. He was looking at how does he get these zones from 0, pure black, which is really over here, all the way to zone 0, for 10, is here in the white. All the ranges in between. So he was really an expert in doing this. Now realize he may not have exactly gotten this in the camera, but he did it later when he was in the dark room to develop this image. Now, how does this relate to digital photography? Well, let's be aware of whether or how much the scene's brightness can exceed your camera's limits. We'll get into this in a little bit more detail. Let's let you make an intelligent decision about how to expose when the tones and contrast in a scene are bigger than what your camera is capable of doing. And it lets you avoid blowouts and highlights and losing any of the detail that you might find in your blacks or your shadows. So it lets you know how much exposure rate in f-stop you need to successfully do an HDR capture. In other words, a high dynamic range capture. So if we're using the zone system for black and white photography, we want to create a high contrast image using the widest range of tones from 0 to 10, from pure black to white. And we want to obtain the broadest dynamic range that we possibly can. We want tonal range and dynamic range. And also, we want to be able to see how colors translate into black and white photography. This latter part is probably the most difficult. I find it challenging to look at a image and understand how it's going to be black and white. That's one of the reasons why we also take other efforts in this presentation to give us an idea of where color can translate well into black and white. So our dynamic range, what is it? It's the difference between the darkest and the lightest tones in an image, generally pure black to pure white. Often used to talk about the maximum dynamic range a camera is capable of. Now here's our chart again, our picture of the dynamic range. Again, if we look at this, 0 at pure black moves us all the way to 10 in the pure white with no texture. So what we really want our camera to be able to do is take this full range of information here so that we can get this texture that is in zone 1, and we can get the texture that's going to be showing up in zone 9. We need this full range to be able to do that. Now, that dynamic range can be a little bit misleading. When we think about looking at an image, or rather looking at a scene, let's go back to that scene where we were looking at the idea of a beautiful lake in fall with all these color variations and so on. Our eye looks at that and it says about 20 stops. So that's a huge range that our eye is able to see. However, your camera is not capable of doing that. Even the best cameras are not able to reach that level for that stop and range. So what we want to do is know, what is our dynamic range of our camera? What tonal ranges do we have available to be able to do this? Well, I watched one video where it took him 30 minutes to go through and test his camera using various tonal sets of the zone range. And frankly, by the time I got done, I said, that's too much work. So I said, okay, there's got to be an easier way to do this. So I went online, I put in my camera, the Canon 70D, and I said, what is the dynamic range or total range of my camera? And it came up with 11 stops at 100 ISO. So if I'm shooting a landscape where I can shoot at 100 ISO and I'm in aperture priority, it allows me to do that. But as I move my ISO range up, it means that my dynamic range is reduced. So if I'm sitting at 12,800, you can see my dynamic range has dropped down to 6.7. Now, why is it important to know the dynamic range of your camera? It tells you how much dynamic range your camera can photograph in a single shot. In other words, if I'm going back to that landscape image and I have a lot of wind going on, then I'm dealing with trees in motion and grass in motion, maybe even the water in motion. And the only way I'm going to adjust this if I'm in an aperture priority mode is to increase my ISO. I increase it too much, well, what am I going to do? I'm losing these stops, either this end or this end, or somewhere in between. So I want to be able to preserve as much of my dynamic range as I possibly can. Whoops, backtrack here. As I possibly can. So at 800 ISO, I've got 10 stops. But at 12,800, I'm really down on my number of stops that I have in the dynamic range. So what can you do to compensate for reduced dynamic range or tonal range? Well, mammalian cameras have the ability to shoot 3 or more images in a setting for over or under or correct exposure, which is generally referred to as high dynamic range photography. Now, it's recommended, and as I remember, didn't we have an individual who did a program night where he was recommending always shooting a high dynamic range with at least 3 images under, over, and correct?
Mm-hmm.
Thinking correctly, that's true?
Yes, he did.
So we did have somebody there that did that. Now, you can combine them to get this
Ray
full,
Mabry, I think.
but you don't have to. You can not combine them, but at least having those ranges of low, under and over, you can then bring them in if you want to do so. So it's kind of like an insurance that allows you to make that option available. Now, what we're going to do is evaluating the contrast to determine what is going to give up on your phone if you, or on your image, if you want to do a full dynamic range. Now, as I said, if I'm taking an image with a lot of wind, and I want to make sure that the image is caught without that movement of the trees and the movement of the grass and the water, I'm going to have to increase my ISO. So I have to look at the image and adjust it to create those dynamic range. So here's an example here. This image was taken in Nesquin Beach in Oregon, and I did shoot it with HDR, high dynamic range image. So this was the middle image. I've got, if you look at it, I've got highlights are showing up here, the white that may be a little blown out. I've got mid ranges that are showing in here. I've got some of the shadowing that are here. So I've got a pretty good dynamic range in this image. However, if I look at the low contrast portion of this, I'm starting to blow out the sky. I've definitely blown out this part of the image with the sun, and I've lost a lot of the darker portions of the image. And here's the high contrast image where I preserved a lot of the midtones, a little bit of the highlights, but most of that is in the black area. Or if we look at this in the zone, what zone is this one? What zone?
0,
10?
10, 0.
I would say 9.
Okay. Well, actually, black is 0.
1 or 2.
Things to remember. And
The other way.
flips it. Okay. So one of the methods that you can do is put your camera on a tripod, put it in manual mode, and meter for each, put it into spot metering. The spot metering allows your camera to measure a relatively small area. If you look 1 to 5% in the viewfinder, what you want to do is determine the tonal areas that you want to preserve. So going back, I'm at a higher ISO than I would normally be. So I'm not going to be able to get the full range in one shot. I want to make sure that I'm getting at least what I want. Do I want to preserve the highlight end of the image, or do I want to preserve the darker, the image, the black end from 0 to 10? So I adjust that settings, and here's what I come up with. If I take Ansel Adams' viewpoint here, I'm shooting, if I'm going to not have the dynamic range, do I want to shoot for this waterfall right here, which is a 10, which is pure white, or do I want to preserve the blacks over here? Well, I've got a choice. I can move my compensation in my metering in one direction or the other. If I move it to the right, it creates more highlights. If I move it to the left, it creates more darks. If I move it to the left or to the right, I'm going to get more of this. If I move it to the left, I'm going to get more of this. Here's an example. Here's what you're looking at an image through your camera. So here's your range, which is minus 1 stop, 2 stops, 3 stops. So you can adjust this metering this way to preserve the highlights. If you move it this way, and you want to preserve the blacks or the shadows. All right. And what are the other methods that we use to check whether or not we are getting a full dynamic range in our camera? Is the use of our histogram. Now, my camera doesn't show up with a histogram when I'm looking at the image. My understanding, and those of you that are using a mirrorless camera, can you see that histogram before you take the image?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, you can. But you don't have to because you have, what you see is what you get.
Yeah. Oh, that's an advantage for us old timers that are still on the older mirrored cameras. We have to wait until after we take the shot to be able to see that histogram. So the histogram is something that measures the distribution of the light in an image. It shows the number of pixels in each of the brightness of your image. So the number of pixels are shown vertically, and around from the bottom, from the left to right, you're showing the distribution of that light from black at 0% brightness to 100% brightness in white. By the way, if you eliminate that 0, you're back to your zone system. And that's one way of keeping it in mind. Okay, here's a histogram. Now, our verticals tell us how much we have of light within that area. In other words, the number of pixels that are showing in that. We also have our midtones in this range, shadows in here, highlights in here. Now, what does this histogram tell us? Do we have more highlights or do we have more shadows?
More shadows.
More shadows. So if I wanted to adjust my image to get more highlights, I would have to move my metering over to my right to try to move this over into the highlight area. Now, may lose something over here in the shadows by being able to do that. But it depends on what you want to preserve. Do you want to preserve these shadows or do you want to preserve these highlights? Now here's another view of a histogram. Here whoops, sorry about that, back. One of the things I've done here is that this image has got our zones across the top. So pure black at 0, white at 10, and we've also got the percentages that show up here. Now, what are these numbers here? Anybody have any idea? Well, they're actually a JPEG range of tones or colors, which are 255. And that is one way of also measuring where your tonal ranges are. And we'll see this when we look at Photoshop, because as we roll over our image in Photoshop, these numbers show up. So it's something that is a good reference range as well. Now, what does this histogram tell us?
Too dark.
Very dark. We have almost no white down here, no highlights showing up. However, it looks as if have problems in this edge where we're cutting off the whites. And more than likely, even though we're not entirely there, we may be cutting off some of the blacks as well. Now, here's an example of images that are too bright. I put on in Lightroom, I put on the right here on the sensor that tells me that I've got too much bright. Also, my histogram is moved to the right, which tells me that I've got too much light, almost no black. Although if you look closely, the bird has a little bit of too much black from cutting off the black. Now here's one the opposite direction, too dark. And how do we know? Well, obviously it's a dark image, but that histogram is also advantageous to tell us that it is moved primarily to the left. So if I want more light in this, more of the highlights over here, what do? I have to move this metering to my right to bring in more highlights into this. Okay, so here's another image, again of Nesquim Beach. It's pretty well balanced. How do we know? Well, here we've got some shadowing in this area. We've still got some highlights, and our mid-ranges are pretty good. So that's our histogram that helps us decide whether or not we've got a good image or not. Now, how do we relate this to the zone system? Well, there are not many programs left that relate specifically to the zone system. I'm aware of only one, and that's Nick's Silver Effects Pro 2. And many of us still use that. I use it extensively. And on the bottom of the histogram, it will show me where these things are. Here's an example. Okay. Right down here, these are the zone systems from 0 to 10. And this highlight, if I roll over these images in here, roll over these zones, it will light this up. Now I'm going to try to do that. I'm going to go off of the screen sharing, and I'm going to stop it for a moment. Don't panic, I'm coming back. I'll go ahead and stop the screen sharing. And what I'm going to do is try to find my neck filter. Now, I've got it here. And I'm back to the same issue of trying to restart my, well, I'm on the speaker view. Oh, down here at the bottom. Okay. Okay, here is Silver Effects Pro. Everybody see that all right?
Yep, looks great.
Yeah.
Now, if I'm in this image, which is exactly the same image I had before, and I come down to the histogram, which is down here in the lower right, and I roll over the histogram numbers,
Oh,
I
wow.
do.
Wow, nice.
It matches the zones. So I'm sitting at 4, and it is showing these are the images, the part of the image which is zone 4. If I move over to 9, you can just barely notice, actually 8, let's do 8. Up in the sky,
Yeah.
upper right-hand portion, you can see where zone 8 is. So if I move down here to 1, I've got texture still left. But if I'm on 0, it means that this area here is all right. So it just gives you an idea that Nick still preserves it. Does anybody else know of any software that's out there that actually shows the zone system?
No,
Oh,
I didn't even know that Nick did.
I didn't either.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, Nick is
well,
the
you know,
only-
you can see a histogram.
yeah, but you don't normally get to see how it relates unless you think about the zone system. And I can tell you, it's hard enough to think about zone systems as it is. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to go back, and I'm going to see if I can go to, let's see if I can go back to my PowerPoint. Where are you? Nope, I'm going to change my desktop. And where is my PowerPoint on here? Get out of this moment. Hopefully I can get back into it. One of the challenges. Sharing at the bottom. We're going to go back to my PowerPoint. Okay.
Yeah.
Everybody back to my PowerPoint?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
So we've got 0 in our blacks all the way to our 10 with our whites. Okay, here's another way of looking at this histogram information. We have the zone systems here, explanations in regard to where the details, and then we start incorporating these 0 to 255 that we're going to see in Photoshop as a range that we would relate. So just to give you a quick example, if we're looking at zone 5, which is our mid-tone grays, it's 127. And everything between is darker here or lighter. Okay, here's another example with an image, which we have these ranges that exist. Here's our pure what?
White.
White, okay, pure white at 255 or a 10 zone, or,
Black.
okay. But we do have in between, so we can see the ranges that exist between. Okay, now, by looking at our histogram, it helps us also determine whether or not an image can go black and white or not. Part of the aspect of an image that we're looking at, and this is as we're walking in and I haven't taken the picture, I'm going to say, okay, I think this is pretty good range. I take the picture, and lo and behold, what does my histogram say? Well, I've got some shadows here. I've got not quite enough in the area of the highlights that I'd like to see. So what do you think? Will this turn into a good black and white? Yes.
Maybe not.
Anybody else? No winners, no losers here.
Well, it's not the full range, but
Full range.
You
Let's
could
see.
adjust the histogram to make it the full range.
Yes, you could. You can adjust your stops to the right and move more to get a better range in the whites. So here's the image that you have with the black and white. It's pretty good. And you notice that nothing has been adjusted here. Straight in from the camera into black and white.
You can manipulate the color also.
Oh, yes. That's forthcoming. Let's decide that you are still using a camera like mine and you're walking around and you want to say, oh, I can't tell whether this is going to be good black and white image. Well, you could go out and buy one of the Tiffin black and white viewing filters. They're about $44 and they turn things kind of an orangish, but the ideal thing here is to eliminate the colors and be able to see the contrast much better. Or you could squint your eyes. Now, every time I ask my wife, what do you think? Would this be a good black and white? She goes, squint your eyes. And I go, what? She squint your eyes. And she's an artist, so she has the ability to do this. It took me a while to get to do this and do it reasonably well. Well, what it does is it removes most of the colors. It shows contrast better, and you can see lights and darks easier. Now, don't expect when you do this that things will be clear and sharp, because they're not. So I'm going to ask everybody to do a little practice here with squinting. Now, here's an image that we might think about turning into black and white. So for those that are adventurous, squint at this image. Go ahead. No one's looking.
Except for the recording.
Oh, that's right. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay. So what do you see when you squint your eyes?
Mostly sort of dark tones. I don't really see any whites.
Okay. Now just to cheat a little bit, what does this histogram tell us?
Oh, same thing.
Yeah.
Underexposed to touch. You could have some exposure.
So you could move it to the right. Maybe you would be able to get some more of the light in there. So here's the image. Black and white. Not terribly good. You have mostly the dark side rather than good total range to work with. Now, what about this one? Try squinting at this one.
No.
Not enough contrast.
Yep.
Yeah, too light.
Too light, not enough darks. It's kind of a flat image anyway. And our histogram tells us what? Lots of midtones.
Midtones.
Not much contrast.
Yeah. So there's our black and white image. Really flat. You'd have to really push to get the dynamic range on this to get it to look good. Okay, another one. Squint your eyes. What do you think?
Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of contrast.
Okay, and our histogram helps us out here. If you didn't have this in a post-production or after you taken the shot, you wouldn't have that ability. So what do we got? Yeah, it's pretty good. Yeah, no adjustments going on yet from the standpoint of light, darks, highlights, shadows, and so on. So it has good possibilities. One other way of looking at a scene is whether or not you have directional light. Your light is coming straight down from the top. Everything tends to be rather flat. But if you've got directional light, it gives you an idea of something. So let's see what happens. Is it going to be? Yeah. No Instagram here to give anything away. Actually, this is almost already black and white as it is, and we've eliminated the colors in regard to that. Now, one of the other things that we want to do, particularly when we're going into black and white, is the emphasis on texture. If we've got a good textural image, then we probably should think about turning into black and white. So, does this have good texture?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, and so on is a good one. So, yeah, it turns out to be a pretty good black and white image.
Great picture.
Yeah.
So, another way is, do we have lots of highlights and do we have lots of shadows? And one way of looking at this is that, yeah, we've got highlights showing up here, here. We've got fairer, some shadowing in here. Terrible sky. So what are we going to do? Is this going to be a good black and white? What do you think?
No.
Yes? No?
No.
No. That sounds like Liz. Well, it's not really. One of the things there's not enough time in this program to go into is that our greens, our ranges in greens are not enough to differentiate them clearly. And we really don't. If we replace this guy, maybe we'd have something decent to work with. All right. Now, converting to black and white, at least temporarily. There are various ways of doing this. And I'm going to show you, here's a black and white image. We've got, it's not taken during midday. We've got long shadows. You can see that in here. We've got some fairly good tonal ranges showing up in our histogram. We've got some textures showing up in the hillside. It turns out to be a pretty good black and white. I'm missing a lot of the midtones here and some of the highlights to work with. Better down here where you can see the histogram even better than that. So how do we turn things black and white, but also using the color sliders? As I think it was Nancy that was saying, the color sliders can be a real advantage to adjusting our colors and making that mix even better. We move on to the next.
Tim?
Yeah.
Tim, you were
Yeah.
talking about how to choose what
Yes.
make good. I just do in Lightroom library, I hit the V key and then hit it back again and it turns to, turns to black and white, and then it's just a real fast way that I use to kind of think if it might be good. I mean, yours is much more
Yes, I agree.
full-bodied, but if a quickie from
Yeah.
from the library.
And let me show you here more detail. How are we doing on time?
20 after 8.
Doing fine.
Okay. So I'm going to stop sharing again. Bear with me. And I'm going over to my Lightroom. And I'm going to go back and share again. And it is here. Okay, can everybody see the Lightroom image of that
Yes.
Yep.
before?
Yes.
Okay, now I'm going to move it from the library into development. All right, there's the image. No adjustments have been made on it whatsoever. And as you know, as Nancy was saying, you can control it by hitting the B key, or I can hit, let me go back to color, or I can go to the black and white and turn it over that way. And that is a good way of doing it. Now, one of the things also is now available in Lightroom is profiles. So if I go over here to this 4 squares or grids and slide down here, I've got various black and whites just by rolling over and looking at them. So that's one way of doing it. The problem, let's go ahead and just select that one and I'll close it. The problem here is that you are limited by something that takes place when you go to black. Your vibrance and saturation are grayed out. You don't have any access to them. But you do have this area, which is called B and W, and that is sliders that you can be using to adjust your colors. And we know there's green in this image. So if I slide to the right, or slide, whoops, why am I not seeing this?
The yellow. There's a lot of yellow in the green I found.
There we go. So I can slide it that way. I can also go up, you see this right here, this tag that I can never remember the name of. And if I adjust that and come back to the image, I can adjust more than one slider at a time. You can see there that the yellow and orange are moving. And one of the things that is nice about this is that if you get your oranges where you want them and you want to adjust around that, you can move your images, your sliders above it or below it to get changes, and your orange stays in exactly the spot that you want it. So that's use of your sliders in black and white, which does give you some more choices to work with. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to go and I'm going back to my PowerPoint, back into sharing. Okay, everybody see the PowerPoint now?
Yep, it's back.
All right. So if we go on, one of the other things that you can do, come on, move, there we go, is the idea of post-production in which you're using the Photoshop to do this. And we'll also go through Lightroom. Now, I know I've been talking for quite some time, and you've probably been sitting there going, oh, so I want everybody to stand up. No? Yes? Move around, get, you know.
I get the idea.
Stretch is one way of doing this. Not playing baseball, but, you know. Now, I sent this PowerPoint, actually, Bill sent it out. Thank you, Bill, sending it out. So these instructions on how to use Photoshop to develop high dynamic range images are there for you to use. Rather than my going through and detailing each one of these steps verbally, I'm actually going to go in to Photoshop and do this directly so you get a chance to see it. And then using this information that you got, I mean, if you want to do a screenshot with this right now, you're welcome to do so. Put it back to this first one, give you a chance to screenshot. And then that one.
Thank you.
Now I'm going off my stop sharing. I know this is getting tedious. And I'm going to Photoshop. And I'm going to use, whoops, gotta come back again. All right, everybody see the Photoshop image?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, if you're, this is a JPEG image. If you're using the Photoshop and you're using a, you know, a raw image, you're going to go through another step. But once you hit that step, you can hit continue, and it will take you to this image or to this format right here. Now, one of the things that you need to do is that you need to have certain of these frames, there's a word for it, frames open. And if you don't and you're not used to using Photoshop, come over to Windows and make sure that these are checked. So I want to make sure my history is checked, my layers are checked, my properties are checked. Now I also want to make sure my histogram is checked. All right, so that is showing up there. So I also want to make sure information. We'll get to the histogram shortly. So I've got my properties, I've got my layers showing up. And first thing I want to do is that I want to convert this to black and white. I come down here to the bottom of the screen to the adjustment layer, and I click on it, and one of my choices is black and white. Okay, so it's converted the image to black and white. Now, if I move my cursor, my arrow over here, over the image, and I move it back and forth, and I'm looking at the information in there, do you see those numbers that are changing?
Mhm. Yep.
Numbers right here. Now, if I move to different parts, what are those numbers telling me?
You're in zone 0 or 2 or 1. I mean,
One, because in this case, I'm looking at almost black. And this is again, those numbers that are related to a JPEG image from 0 to 255. So I've been moving over into the lighter area. Those numbers start growing higher toward that 255. So I'm probably in the neighborhood of an 8 you know, in the neighborhood of more toward my whites. So that's the only thing that Photoshop has that relates to a zone system. You have to translate that in your head to get to that. Sorry about that. It does have percentages over to the right. So it does give you some of that information, but it's still color percentages. It's not black and white percentages showing up. All right, now I can adjust these images, this image, by using these sliders. I can go back and forth. Not much red showing up. We know there's a fair amount of yellow. You can see how they're different. If I come over here to the cyan, it changes the images in the background. Now, if I want to do what I did with Lightroom, I can click on this, which looks like a handle with a slider back and forth. I've got to make sure that I click on this icon right down here, which is actually making sure that all of the layers are showing up. Now, if I come back over here, hold my mouse button down, I can then move this across and see where it changes. So what is turned to blue is actually turning the image lighter or darker. I can do it down here. So I can relate that image to what's happening with the sliders in the right-hand side. So I want to change her, make her a little darker. So it's giving an opportunity to adjust those color ranges to work with. Now, I can also, if I want to do this, I can also look at my histogram and see what's going on with my histogram. And I'm going to adjust that. So say, for instance, I want to increase this highlighted area. So I can move that way over, really bright, and adjust my, whoops, what am I doing here? I'm clipping, I move things too far to the right.
Yeah, the highlights.
Highlights are too far to the right. I preserve some of the blacks. Well, you know, one of the things that you can do is come back here and move this back. But let's say that you really want those highlights to be there and you really like how bright it is. So as I move it over here and I see clipping going on, yeah, I'm going to clip those highlights. What can I do about it? Well, we're going to use the curves to be able to adjust that. So I'm going to come down here to my adjustment layer, and I'm going to go to curves. And the way to adjust that is to adjust it by the output that you're going to be getting. This is what I'm going to be looking at. Now to do this, I go up here to the highlighted side of my histogram, and I grab the top of it, and you can see right now that it's setting at 252. If I draw that down, what's happening to my histogram? It's moving to the left. So let's try, 148, 149. Just the histogram here, and I have the dynamic range. Maybe I can move it back a little bit, but I'm not cutting things off. So you have the ability to adjust your dynamic range using curves to do that. Now, I want to create more dynamic range on this side. So if I move it here, I can move it down. And I can move, I remember I want texture showing up here, not pure black. So I moved it to 4 as an output. So this is a one way of using Photoshop to not only adjust the color or the tonal values, but also at a full dynamic range that you want using your curves and your histogram. All right. I'm going to come off of this. I'm going to stop the sharing. And by the way, these changes of tones is really a personal issue. If you like it darker, if you like it lighter, you're the one that's controlling it. No one else is doing that. You're not hitting an automatic. You're actually being able to do it yourself. I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to go to Lightroom. I'm going to, bear with me here, I'm going to move into another area before I come back. Okay. I'm going to share my screen again. And I'm going to look at Lightroom because we're going to try Lightroom here as our method. Okay, everybody see Lightroom on there?
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the image, same image that we had before. It's in the library. I'm going to move it into the development side. This is to add some adjustments to it. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to hold down my Option key and I'm going to reset my tones. I'm going to reset the areas of presence. I'm going to come down here. I'm going to reset that. So we're back to really a 0. I'm going to adjust my temp here, put it at 0. Okay. Now, without doing anything here, although I could go to auto and see how that adjusts, but I said, no, I'm going to do this just by itself. I'm going to come down here. I'm going to come down to the HSL colors. Remember we used that for the ability to move our image in luminosity. In this case, I'm going to, whoops, this should be on color, I'm sorry. Well, I'm going to go back to the library and I'm going to select this one. Let's do it correctly from the beginning. Okay, so remember we could have select black and white. We could have gone to profiles, but in this case, I want to turn off my saturation. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to drag all these over to the left. And what have I done? I've created a black and white image, but one of the key features is that I still have my vibrance and saturation sliders available to me. Now, I can go in and adjust hues, which are not going to do any good. So I want to adjust luminosity. So let's say I want the yellows to be brighter. Oh, I can hit this right here, and I can do it from the screen on the image. So I associate the two. Here, and adjust that. Basically, I've got lots of abilities to adjust. And if I've got something set, like for instance, I've got my orange exactly where I want it, I can move my red slider, not much red in there. Or I can use the yellow slider to adjust. And my orange stays exactly where it is. Now, that's not the end of it. I can come up here, and most of us don't think about it, but I can adjust the temperature. So if I move it to the left, it gets brighter. But if I move it to the right, I've got more flexibility here. Look at my histogram, what it's doing. Mm-hmm. Most of us don't think about moving our temperature. Possibility. I can also use increase the vibrance. Doesn't do all that much, a little bit. I can also adjust the saturation, which I couldn't do before if I turned it just to black and white using that process. So let's say, for instance, just as an example, I've taken the blues as we did before and really brightened them up. Or let's try the aquas. No. Well, I'm sitting in hue, dummy. What is not working? Okay. Let's say I want to brighten up the yellows a lot. Or we brighten up the aquas a lot. What's happening in my histogram? Moving to the right, and I maybe it's starting to clip. So how do I adjust the dynamic range using Lightroom? Well, I can do it using the black and white sliders. And you can slide them to the right to create more white. But before doing that, clip on these here to make sure that they're on, and then adjust that white. Whoops, I'm starting to clip. So I want to back it off. I want to get more black. See how that histogram moves? Oh, getting a little clipping. Now some people, including myself, hold down my Option key, and then I can adjust this way to see where my blacks are. And some of us like to show a little bit more black, even though it's clipping. We don't want to show any white here. Whoops, too much there. So I'm going to come back off. It gives me a chance to adjust this. And again, it's up to your decision. But what you're looking for here is that you want to increase the texture and the quality of the image and making sure it's really crisp. So that is using Lightroom and using, I'm coming off my screen here. Bear with me. I'm going back to my PowerPoint. And I'm going to share the screen. Okay, are we back to the PowerPoint? No, we're not.
There you go.
Okay, you are sharing the screen. Okay, good. All right, so let's move on. And by the way, here's the information for Lightroom Classic, which is, so if you want to do a screen print, feel free to do it. Whoops, sorry. Let me back up one. There's the first page. And the second page if you want to do a screen print. All right. Now, have we met the goals that we wanted to, that we started out with? So, do we've given reasons for turning our images into black and white? I think so. Reducing color and so on. Can we produce better black and white images through understanding the zone system? Well, I hope so. No
We'll have
challenge.
to practice.
It doesn't practice. And learn to look at a scene and use metering to determine the best exposure, understand dynamic range and how it relates to the camera setting, using your histogram, contrast, light direction, and texture, determine if the photo can be turned to black and white. And then learning the two methods with creating dynamic range in Photoshop and in Lightroom. So I leave you with a challenge. Go out, take photographs using the zoom system, your histogram, other methods described in this presentation. Download them, convert using your chosen ones for black and white. Using the system we talked about here, compare some of your older black and white images to the ones you just did. If the newer ones are better, consider re-editing the older images and use the methods described here. Questions? And I want to thank everybody for their patience.
Thank you.
Thank you.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tim.
You.
And we have monochrome coming up next time, so that's a challenge.
Yeah.
Yep, that would be a good one. Let me come out of this. I'm going to stop screen saving here. I think I'm back with everybody.
Nicely done, Tim.
Yes.
Very nice, Tim.
Thank you, Tim.
Good
Right?
info, good
Tim,
explanation.
that black and white viewer, do you just look through the viewer with your eye to?
Yes. You hold it up to your eye,
Huh.
look through it. It
Oh.
does take some getting used to because it does turn images, and I wish I had got my camera out and taken a picture with you, you would be able to see it.
Mhm.
It does create kind of an orange quality, yellow-orange quality to it. But it is handy. I've got it, when I take my camera out, I've got it in my pocket. So I pull it out and take a look of what it might look like in black and white.
So it's not like a filter, it's just a little like eyeball thing.
It is a filter, but it's adapted to use.
You hold in your hand though, right? Not attached to your lens?
No, it's not attached to your lens.
Okay, yeah.
Hold up and I got mine through Amazon. And so it's something to, and I think, what's the other big camera company,
B&H.
B&H or Adorama.
Yeah, they do have them there. So it's something to consider if you want to use that. Squinting is a viable option.
That's a good one.
That's a good one. Definitely see your highlights and shadows.
Yep, yep.
I have another suggestion for people to consider. Many times you can turn your profile on in your camera to black and white. You can still shoot in RAW. The RAW image will be still saved as RAW, but the view on your back of your LCD screen or
Oh,
in the
that's good.
viewfinder will
Uh-huh.
show it in black and white, so you get a preview of what it looks like.
Is that
No, you're.
Nikon or Canon?
I think both Nikon and Canon can do that. I suspect Sony can as well.
All right.
I know, definitely know Nikon can do that.
I tried to do it in Sony and couldn't.
Yeah,
Okay,
Canon can. I've used it many times.
yes.
And Fuji, you definitely can. In fact, in the Fuji cameras, you can do a bracket and choose 3 different film simulations, and it'll do 3 of them. So
Oh.
instead of seeing the different brackets, you see 3 different film simulations, and they could be different black and white ones, or they could be black and white color, the different sims.
now one thing that you might try is that if you're using your iPhone and your phone, and then this is one of the apps that I use is called Camera One. And it is an app that shoots only in black and white. Camera One is the number 1.
Another thing you can do in the many cameras is you can take your photo and then you can, in the camera, do a post-process inside the camera and create a JPEG out of your RAW file in monochrome. And so you'll have both when you're looking at it in post-processing.
Olympus, this is Gustavo. Olympus has the ability also to do the same thing. If you are doing, if you have the setting to do both RAW and JPEG, the JPEG will be black and white. The RAW obviously will be what it is, and you can always modify it. And in terms of iPhone, what I use is an app, and I think it's free still. It's called Lenka, and that's a black and white app.
Leica?
Lenka with an L.
Okay.
How do you spell it, Gustavo?
That's good.
How do you spell it, Gustavo?
Oh, I'm sorry. Hold on. Let me look it up. Oh, it's L-E-N like Nancy, K-A.
Okay, thank you.
Fine. Any other questions? So I'm looking forward to seeing images that you go out and take using these various methods and see when they show up different than you would normally show up your black and whites.